Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I'm joined by Dr. Andy Coggin and Hunter Allen. We're all here to present for you together tonight. Say hello, gentlemen.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, how's it going, folks?
All right. We've got a great presentation for you tonight about data relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about the uniqueness and how WKO4 opens some doors to look at data in some different ways. Just as a little housekeeping, we are going to keep tonight's let me just get everything working here. We are going to keep tonight's webinar on a tight schedule. We're targeting 45 minutes for presentation time and 15 minutes for Q&A. It's my experience that the Q&A sort of blends into the presentation time, so I would expect it to be approximately an hour. A little bit of homework here. If you have questions as we go, you can easily just ask them. Simply, you can open the system by this little arrow. Will allow this little gray box that's probably in the top right-hand corner of your screen to open and close. One of the selections you have is questions. If it's a plus mark, it's not open. So just click on the plus and it'll open and look like this. You can type your question here and you'll review answers will come up here. So feel free to jump in, ask questions. There'll be times where I'll be presenting or Hunter will be presenting or Andy will be presenting. I tend to answer questions as I go, but we will definitely each look at the questions before we pass the baton to the next person. Let's start with a little bit of background. For me, the entire WKO4 project is so exciting. I have a background in data analytics in a totally different world. And in my totally different world, we talked all the time about data mining. We used to do processes of taking massive data sets and really crunching what we learned in there. And the funny thing is, it's kind of a top-down, bottom-up exercise because you sort of know what you're looking for and you sort of don't. And what you're doing is you're just kind of learning. You're finding patterns. You're looking for, unique things that emerge. And when you data mine in a computer way, right, the computer's doing a lot of the thinking for you. Well, when we do it in a human way, we're the ones who do the thinking. The challenge, though, of data mining in endurance sports is, well, first, what really is data mining, right? Data mining is the process of discovering actionable information. Actionable information is such a key. You can look at a lot of data, right? And you don't always see some actionable information. You don't always are not able to find that pattern that becomes relevant. But the challenge that we've had is we've been lacking in a tool powerful and flexible enough to do it. So much of the data tools, whether you want to call them data management, data analytics, data reporting, so much of the tools in the endurance sport world have a lot of limits. They're very limited in a sense because they are reporting tools. WKO4 is the first analytical engine ever created specifically for endurance sports. Probably everyone on this presentation has already heard that, but why is that important when we start, talking about different topics like data relationships? Because it is a powerful engine that allows us to explore. It's not locked into predefined solutions. We're not saying, wow, we have 4 or 5 ways or 10 ways of looking at data and we have to find some pattern. We actually have an unlimited amount. I'm not quite sure unlimited. We have an amazingly large amount of ways to look at this data and begin to find these patterns. When you start thinking about the data that we work with in endurance sports, we can break them into 3 categories: performance, modeled, and environment. Some examples, but certainly not limited to. You start thinking about performance, you're thinking about a generated data, power, cadence, pace. Data that is typically known as a channel in WKO4 world is typically known as a variable, and it's data that is generated by performance. We have modeled data that's driven by some construct, equation, algorithm, something that's giving us an estimation or a modeled solution. So we have normalized power, intensity factor, TSS. Normalized graded pace for runners is another one. Power balance. A lot of left-right power is left-right power, but isn't exactly. It's being driven by an algorithm or a model. And certain devices, particularly one-legged devices, use that same approach, one pedaling crank arm devices. We also have environmental data, things like temperature, elevation, grade. where that data has been collected for a long time and has been available, so nothing really new in any of this, just breaking them down into 3 groups. Well, when we start thinking about data mining this, we're really not data mining. It's really more like data exploring. And it's kind of something I was joking about in an early webinar. It's like being a WKO4 treasure hunter. You're using this analytics engine to find patterns. You're looking for actionable intelligence, as we like to call it, but you're looking for actionable information, things that are rising to the top and helping you identify patterns and things that you can do with the information. The good news about the way it is in WKO4, it's easy to use and getting easier. You have multiple formats to express. You can be visual, you could be numerical, you could be reported, redundant, but all types of different ways to look at data, which we're going to show you some examples of here tonight. So the reality is, in all of this, we're treasure hunting. We're looking for these unique data relationships. Tonight's presentation, Hunter, Andy, and myself are going to show you things that we've each found and or developed or created in a way that we didn't start out knowing 100% what we were looking for, but we were exploring relationships and pushing, some of the boundaries and building unique and different actionable intelligence resources, charts, graphs, which we'll go over. Giving a little bit of background about these steps of exploring, and then we'll jump into some examples. This is kind of how I like to lay it out. I think it just gives you, if you're doing this and you're coaching business, or if you're an athlete using, here's just a pretty good process to help you wrap your brain around a good way to go out and do some of these activities. Use the data, go exploring on your own. Step 1 is so important. You need to define the problem. As we help a lot of people with WKO4 making and building really cool stuff, one of the things that I constantly say is you need to go back. What question are you answering? What problem are you solving? Where are you starting? If not, everything seems cool and everything sort of looks right. You got to have sort of a defined, purpose. You got to define the problem. You have to have a question when you start. 2, prepare and explore the data. What type of data you're looking for? What world, what realm, what stuff type of. So really start thinking about what it is that you want to look through, and you're preparing this data based on what your end goal is and an understanding of your problem. Then you start to build the model. I will tell you, and probably anybody who's been experimenting with WKO4, I don't mean the model like a power duration model or something like that. I'm like, start building on your chart, your report, whatever it is. And I'll tell you, as we all know, it rarely becomes 1, right? It usually takes us about 10 till we get it. And suddenly you're like, wow, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Well, that starts by just building the 1. There's no way of skipping right to perfect model number 10. It definitely is kind of this learning as you go process. So you got to, once you kind of have your problem, you prepared your data, jump right in and start looking at it in new and unique ways. Then do some validation. If you're coming to some hypothesis, you're beginning to say, wow, I'm seeing a pattern, look at it for different athletes. Share it with a couple of athletes or coach friends. Don't just look at one data set. There is that's a trap, for a better way of saying it. You really can think you see conclusions in one data set, which you need to look at a lot more data to even begin to say, wow, there's a pattern here. And finally, with WKO4, deploy it. Push it out there, let other people bang away on it, put it on the wattage list, put it, somewhere where people can access it and say, hey, try this. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what this data is telling me. Do you see the same? And then see what kind of feedback and input you get back. So just good little 5-step process for thinking about kind of creating and building your own data relationships. Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to give you some examples. We're going to do 3 sections to the examples, exactly like I laid out the data. We're going to do physiological, environmental, and Hunter's going to take us through a specific form of utilizing specific data in this venue. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy. Andy, do you want me to drive the screen or do you want me to send it to you?
You can go ahead and drive the screen.
All right, I'm on. Okay, jumping into the physiological. There we go.
Oh, better jump ahead a couple slides then. You didn't get the reordered one.
Sorry about that.
Next slide, please.
That one?
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
That's bad.
You didn't get the one. You didn't get the one with the text.
I did not. I'm sorry about that.
Do you want to shoot me the screen?
I do. I do see it in my email at
Try
80.
to.
Let's see. There you go.
Sorry about that, folks. That's what happens when you're
Okay, we see your screen now.
too many cooks. All right. Tim was describing a process for data analysis, and most recent build of WKO4 introduces some new expressions, and the next, or in the soon to upcoming bill, will introduce even more expressions. I'm going to start with one that's actually not out there quite yet, but that is the notion of stamina. And because these expressions are all new, even I, as the originator of the ideas, am still at the build the mental model and start to explore data. So no guarantees that these are like the best ways of looking at results in terms of charts or reports and etc. But it's really sort of the beginnings. Starting with stamina, I think the best way to explain the idea here is you might think of this as endurance, but that term gets used so much that I thought it would be better to refer to stamina. But if you want to think of the power duration model, we have a parameter in there, functional reserve capacity. And what that really represents from a physiological perspective is, as the slide reads, it's your resistance to fatigue during very high intensity, short duration exercise. In other words, above your functional threshold power. And since it's modeled as a capacity, the units are either kilojoules of work or joules per kilogram. Contrast that with stamina represents really your resistance to fatigue during very prolonged exercise, that is below your threshold. And the units, the way we're presenting it here, is really just sort of a percent of maximum. 100% stamina would be the theoretical upper limit. You could be very lacking in stamina and fatigue very quickly, even during sub-threshold activities, in which case you'd be much less than 100%. In point of fact, most people are going to be probably in the 85 to 95% or so range. Now, right now, all I have it is as a report, and I apologize for the small size of the font here on the screen. We need a feature request. We can now vary the font sizes on charts, but we can't vary the font sizes on reports yet. So I'd like to, for my old eyes, like to blow that up. But if you squint and look real closely there, what you see is my stamina expressed as a percent over the 15 years or so worth of power meter data that I have. And I'm a slow twitcher, but my strategy in mass start races is sort of scorched earth. That is try and keep the pace high at all times and try and turn it into a time trial. I was nicknamed, when I was racing back on the East Coast, somebody once referred to me as the Energizer Bunny, because you just got to keep going, and try and wear people down. So that's always been my forte, and perhaps not unexpectedly then you see my stamina is in the mid 90%, lowest might be 88.5% there, all the way up to 97%. The lowest number there, 2000, actually I can't even read the screen. So 2003, it's 82.8%, is a year in which I wasn't really racing or training, and then back here in 2015, I'm still on the comeback trail from a crash. But you can then start to think to yourself, it's like, okay, well, now we have a way, a number, we can pin a number on somebody's resistance to fatigue during prolonged exercise. What contributes to that, aside from looking across individuals and saying that this is some innate characteristic? Well, one thing that comes to my mind immediately is, well, what's the relationship between that and your overall training load? So the next slide here is just a scatter chart for those all those different seasons with my average training stress score, or sorry, average CTL in TSS per day across the bottom, and then the stamina expressed as a percentage on the y-axis. And is there a relationship there? I'm not 100% certain. It's going to be, like Tim said, you need to not focus on just one athlete, but instead look at multiple athletes. But even though it wasn't earth-shattering when I prepared this chart, and nonetheless I wanted to share it because what it demonstrates is one of the very first places you really want to begin when you start doing data exploration is with scatter charts. You're trying to look at the relationship between two different variables, so you put one on the x-axis and one on the y-axis, and of course the one that's on the x-axis is the independent variable, and the one that's on the y-axis is the dependent variable, that is the one that depends on the x parameter. And you just see, is there a relationship there or isn't there? Like I said, in this case, it's not 100% clear, but it is an excellent way to begin that sort of data exploration. And of course, if you want to prepare scatter charts in WKO4, the expression you use is simply x comma y with the whole thing in parentheses. And in fact, when I go to build charts like that, I sort of cheat to keep track and make sure all my parentheses match up, is I'll type open parentheses, comma, close parentheses, and then I'll position my cursor in front of the comma, and I'll insert the expression of what I want on the x-axis, and then I'll insert the cursor on the other side of the comma after the comma and insert or type the expression of whatever I want on the y-axis. And that way I get my comma and my parentheses where I want. So stamina, it'll be released. I don't know exactly when it'll be released. This is the first time I think Hunter and Tim and Kevin are even seeing it in all its glory. So we'll have to hack around a little bit and decide the best default chart to provide to you, but then it'll go up on Chart Exchange and you can start looking at your own data from this perspective. Something that might be of great interest to triathletes whose races are so long, or if you're over in the UK and you're doing 10s and 25s and 50s and 100-mile time trials, you might look at, well, how or does my stamina change as I alter my training with targeting different distances of time trials. Now the other thing that's just been released in the most recent build of WKO4 are some expressions that attempt to estimate different physiological parameters, in particular your VO2 max and your muscle fiber type and your vastus lateralis expressed as a percentage of your type 1 fiber area. Now these are not new ideas in a general sense, but the actual math is new. The VO2 max is the more accurate of the two, which so far the standard error of the estimate is running around 2 to 3%. So if you did 95% confidence limits, 1.97 times 2 or 3. So it's usually going to be 95% of the time it's going to be within, plus or minus 4 to 6% of your actual directly measured VO2 max. And while that's, ideally you'd have it more accurate than that, the reality is that prior formulas that have been put out there don't perform as well. They're generally within, plus or minus 8 to 10% range. So I think we managed to tighten things up a little bit by leveraging some of the ideas and insights in the data as extracted by WKO4. Of course, the more data you have, the more accurate these things become, at least on average. So if there's anybody out there listening along who has had their VO2 max directly measured and they're willing to share that data, and as well as their mean maximal power data for the 90 days beforehand, I'll be more than happy to take a look at it, and we can continue to refine the formula. Anyway, the data here actually for my wife for 2000, 2001, 2002, then 2003 and 2007. 2000 is when she first started using a power meter. She'd been racing for about 1 year at that point, and power taps became available, and being a right-brained analytical person, she jumped on board early days, almost as early as I did. 2001, she was continuing to train. Now she's really starting to focus a lot on pursuit. 2002 was a breakthrough year in which she actually won elite nationals in the pursuit. 2003, she was just riding for fitness. She had retired from racing, but continued to ride, and hence, run the power meter. Had plenty of data to do the calculations. Then we had a couple kids. She took 5 years off the bike entirely, and then in 2007 decided to wanted to make another push and try and make it to Beijing. So in 2007, she trained for about 7 months. And if you actually look at the VO2 max data, there's a very nice progression here in liters per minute or in mLs per minute per kilogram. Body mass didn't really vary significantly, so it's essentially the same pattern. And that is, starting out just in the mid to upper 50s, increasing to 59, and then up to 63 in her peak year, and then with less training, more recreational sport type stuff, or VO2 max, or estimated VO2 max, I should say, apparently declined right back to about where she was when she started. Then after 5 years off, but then with 7 months of retraining, you can see she gets back to about where she was in her second year of power meter use. So looking at the data here, and we actually did have directly measured VO2 max data on her at the end of this season, and it matches up almost exactly, almost identically with what we have. In fact, if you have either the first or second edition of our book, or VO2 max is in there in a rider A, rider B comparison of pursuit data, so you can pull up the actual number and compare it if you want. But when I prepared this analysis using her data, what it reinforced to me was the conclusion I had reached quite some time ago now, actually, is that we simply ran out of time. That she unretired too late, and with only 7 months of training, couldn't recapture her former glory entirely. But we did get back to at least that level. Over here is fiber type expressed as a percentage of type 1 area, or slow twitch area. Overall, what you can see is definitely skewed toward the slow twitch end of the spectrum. And while she has not had a muscle biopsy, even before I came up with this algorithm, I had already recognized the fact that she's essentially just as much of a slow twitcher as I am, if not more so. But what's interesting is the seeming increase in her percent type 1 area with increasing training load. So starting out 66% and progressing up to almost, is that what, 82 or 92.8? I can't even read it myself, percent type 1 area. Now, actual fiber type conversion is still, to this day, probably somewhat controversial, more so among human investigators than people who do animal studies. It's clear, absolutely, that you can convert type 2X fibers into type 2A. It's clear, I think, that you can get fibers that are co-expression, different myosins, but push comes to shove, can you actually convert a type 2 fiber into a type 1? I would argue that the evidence supports that that's possible, provided the training stimulus is large enough. Others might disagree with me, but there is no question that depending on the type of training, you do get a selective hypertrophy of different muscle fiber types. So that if you do a lot of endurance sports, it's your type 1 fibers that tend to get larger, and if you do a lot of sprint and resistance training, it's your type 2 fibers especially that tend to hypertrophy. So even if there isn't any change in the relative proportions of type 1 and type 2 fibers, as the type 1 fibers grow, they'll occupy a greater percentage of the total muscle volume or muscle cross-sectional area. So in that context, this pattern here makes sense. However, this estimation is not as precise as the estimate of VO2 max. Standard error of the estimate here would probably be plus or minus, I think it's like plus or minus 11%. So you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt and think big picture. But if you have a suspicion that you're skewed toward the slow twitch or the fast twitch end of the spectrum, this might be a way of sort of double checking that. Now again, you start going, well, what is the relationship of what to what? And again, these expressions are all new, and so the data exploration phase is just beginning. But one of the things I thought might be interesting is saying, well, what's the relationship between my 5-minute power, or my estimated VO2 max, and my 5-minute power? So here across these 15 seasons, it's probably actually going this way as I get older. Down, 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 down. But as you can see, looking across 15 seasons, yeah, it looks like there's a pretty good correlation there between my my estimated VO2 max and my 5-minute power, which from a physiological perspective is what you would expect. However, at the same time, it's not an exact one-to-one correlation because the algorithm is not using 5-minute power to estimate VO2 max. So it's again, the use of a scatter plot to try and look and see if there is a relationship between variables. In this case, you would expect one. So in seeing the expected relationship, it gives me more confidence in the estimated VO2 max data, even though I know it works well across individuals in developing it. In this case, it would be fitting within a given individual. And at that point, I think I am done with my share. Yes, the next would be
Excellent.
environmental.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you, Andy. All right, I'll take over and jump right in. You guys can ask questions for Andy if you want. After that, just enter them in the question box. I'm going to jump into some environmental data. One of the things that's kind of interesting here is this is kind of data that we've always collected. We've had temperature and elevation and grade and things like that, but we never really tend to do with it anything with it. I know people know that these things impact our performance, our training, but yet you don't see this out there in any other analytical tool. It was really good to see how Andy's kind of functions with scatter plots. I build some crazy scatter plots. It's always kind of where I begin my thinking. I thought that was a really good point that you made, Andy. It's a great place to think. It's kind of funny. I wanted to put a bunch of scatter plots in here, but I kind of went a different way, which is great. So people see different ways for different people to kind of create some information. So I'm going to look at these 3 core data sets and say, gee, what are some things that I've learned or been experimenting with? Well, let's start out with temperature. This one I've had for a long time. Here's a temperature versus efficiency chart. So basically what I'm tracking here is efficiency, and in the blue you see the top 20 efficiencies. But then down here, I'm binning efficiency. So basically, I'm creating a scatter chart. I'm crossing these 2 pieces of data, temperature and efficiency, and I'm seeing is there a relationship once I bin these efficiencies performance. And efficiency is normalized power divided by heart rate. It's a Joe Friel rating of heart rate efficiency. I would never look at any one piece of that data as telling. Trends over time can be, give us some decent insight. When you look at it here in bins, you look at this athlete, they have a 1.41 average efficiency for all the data we're looking at. 60 to 69 degrees is 1.43, so pretty much on average. 7 to 79, pretty much on average. 80 to 89, pretty much on average. And we do see a decline beginning to happen at 90 to 110. This athlete lives in some pretty high temp area, survives pretty well, but we still see a decline in efficiency at temperature. So the reality is it's giving us some insight. You can see here I also broke out just to always understand the weighting. You always got to be careful when you're looking at averages. So to give an understanding of what percentage of these workouts are happening in there. Kind of one of the funny things in looking at that, I remember starting, I couldn't find this chart, actually save all my old charts, and I found it, but there's a interesting little formula expression in here that I don't see many people using that's really cool and can be highly effective. Red lines are heart rates. So here you just see the average heart rate of every ride. So we're not tracking anything highly specific. We do see the average heart rate gets a little higher. I'm tracking the average temperature. This person tends to they live in heat. but they travel a lot. They race all over the world. So you're just seeing different, some higher variation than normal, but you are seeing some higher temperatures here in the summer. So when you look at the red and the purple data, not the best choices for a screen, you don't see a lot of high correlation. So what I put in here was a standard linear regression line. And the expression for that is just SLR, heart rate, which is the solid one, and SLR, temperature, which is the dashed one, which I actually don't have in my format. I just did it to look. So what these are telling us in the data is that, sure enough, look, temperature was on an upward moving trend throughout this time I'm looking. Well, I'm looking at January through September. That's what I like to call a blinding flash of the obvious. Yes, it got warmer, but the average heart rate was going down. Now, I have no great conclusion off that. This, the chart that I showed here gives me some more actionable intelligence. I understand how this athlete's going to perform at temperature and some possible effects on efficiency factors. But here, this is where I started. I was learning, I was looking, I was trying to figure out what I was looking for. And at the end of the day, this format didn't give me enough information. So it gives me some interesting information, but not actionable enough. So I went on to look for different things. So I used it as an example just to tell you or show you a process of getting there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about elevation. So I did the same process for elevation on efficiency factor. Efficiency is something different. Somebody pointed that out, thank you. Efficiency factor, which is your normalized power divided by heart rate. Same chart up top. I'm looking at the same greatest 20 efficiencies and the average daily efficiency factor. But now look what happens when we look at elevation. Now I've binned this data in elevation, and I cut my chart. I didn't show you percentages, but it's generally similar. So the overall EF at elevation was 1.41. So we see the same athlete in both, by the way. We see from 1 to 2,999 feet, 1.41. 3,000 to 6,000 feet, 1.46. So reality is they're racing more in this. I know what's driving that slight uptick. You're actually seeing it sort of in this time of year in the spring season where you have a lot of races in California and happening at mid-range elevations. But then look what happens when this athlete tends to go over 6,000. I'd use 6,000 to 9,000 feet. You don't see many races over 9, but I guess I could have kept going. We see a pretty big step down in efficiency factor. Well, obviously altitude or elevation is having an effect, so we see change. This tells me something. I figured out this data relationship. I can see and understand it, and I can begin to now solve problems. I could think through what's going to happen to this athlete when they go to 6,000 feet versus when they're at 1 to 3,000 feet. So again, learning and using and looking at data relationships to create unique understanding, actionable intelligence. I, understand the change I need to make in prescribing workouts to this athlete, depending on where they're at in the world. And then 2, I understand the performance response I should be seeing. It's going to be lower, there's going to be effects. But this is when you look at it by efficiency. What if you looked at it different? So this is a pretty cool chart. I've had this for a while. And, at first it's going to look kind of crazy and wacky, but here's what you see, right? So this is Andy's power duration curve. So we see here red, the normal power duration curve for an athlete. And, most of the people on this meeting probably are pretty darn familiar with what this is. And being driven by this, we have the orange line, which is our modeled FTP. Well, what I've done here is I've used expressions to take all workouts. I broke the power duration model in half. What I mean is I did one model in dark red at 4,000 feet and below. And I did a second power duration model just using files driven by 4,000 feet and above. I chose 4,000 feet because this athlete spends a lot of time in the east at sea level and some time in Boulder at 5,000 feet and above. So it took 4,000 to be safe. This person doesn't cross over those two, very much. So look what you get here, right? You get a much lower power duration curve. I called it EC. It should just be E power. So this is at elevation. There's my power duration model. And then here's my power duration model at sea level. It gives me an excellent understanding. I can't scroll across it on the screen of what I would expect my 5-minute power to be up in Boulder or down here in the east. What I would expect my, maybe not down here. We don't have a, this is, we're performing, the bigger gap here is probably just had a stronger sprint file here. Can't guarantee that all of these are super maximal efforts at a short level. So I understand that. Actually, all I'm tracking here with the blue dash line is a percentage variance between the dark red line and the light red line. So we see it's about 85% here. You can't see the tick marks. It's kind of funny, but I know it's about 80, 83. This is about 93. The variation is not that high here that you see. And it kind of peaks out here, or gets closest here. But again, I think that's because I was doing harder efforts in this range. I know this was, just putting in some effort for some of the longer climbs in Boulder. So again, an interesting way to kind of look at data and data relationships. How do I use that data? When I'm in Boulder, I can target a different threshold than versus when I'm in the East, and can base training levels and other factors off that. Okay, one on grade. So grade is a toughie, right? So in build 193, the newest release, you now have rolling normalized graded pace. Rolling normalized graded pace is an interesting tool for runners. As Andy was pointing out, so much of this stuff is new. We're kind of making it as we go. I don't want to say making it up, but we are certainly creating it as we go. It gives us some new insights and tools, and it takes a little time to sometimes break them down. But basically, by having a rolling normalized graded pace, which you're seeing in purple here, versus actual pace in green, we see the effect of grade, so elevation here in gray, has in the effort. We see pace coming down. If we're just tracking pace, we start going up this little hill. Well, it's not a little hill, it's a pretty good hill, as I'll show you. We see pace coming down, but that doesn't mean the physiological cost has gone down. It gives us insight here by staying on the rolling normalized graded pace, how hard it is at any given moment. And in this chart, if you scrolled over it, it would show you exactly at that moment what the elevation, I could have actually put grade in here. Rolling grade is available too, to show you what the actual grade was at that moment. What does make it interesting and a way to use grade and some pacing is I broke it into a report. So I just grabbed 3 sections. I just created 3 sections of that file, one uphill, one downhill. So I took like one here and one here. And it's interesting just to kind of look at the summary of that. And you have to kind of move through the data a little bit better to understand it. But the reality is it gives me some insights of the physiological cost, or the difference between actual pace and rolling normalized graded pace. So you can see here I took actual pace variances. I took the rolling NGP. You really see some, here we see the uphill pace of this runner being slower and the downhill pace being faster. But when you start looking at it in rolling normalized graded pace, you start talking more about what's the physiological cost of those efforts. They reverse. And I think that makes sense. I think it should make sense to you. The reality is the downhill, in this little section I grabbed, and I wasn't looking for anything exactly, I'm just showing an example, was actually more flat. Look, the overall, the expression is climbing now that I think about it. So it is a descent. I just have the expression and then I'll correct it before I send this chart out. But we do see then the average grade of these sections being he was climbing at 11.9% or 11% grade versus a down 10%. So it's a pretty good hill he was running up and down. So again, you're mining this data, you're exploring, you're figuring out relationships. This gives us excellent insight, particularly when you're actually looking at the chart of what the cost was. It gives us greater insight to looking at this data. So those are things just discovered by exploring through the different data sets. Something we really encourage people to try. So that ends mine. I will turn it over to Hunter, and Hunter, I can turn slides if you want. Just let me know what you need.
Yeah, that'd be great. Why don't you do that? Thanks, Tim.
Shoot.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about pedaling, and we've heard from some different things here and ways to look at these different ideas from the environmental and physiological. Now let's look at a specific way to dig into this data from some of the new data that we're getting off of this pedaling. First off, I've come up with a pedaling symmetry testing protocol, and what this is this is a way to learn a little bit more about how you pedal, what is happening with that left leg and with the right leg. So let's just go over that real quick, and then I'll show you some examples of how to do that. Now, the key thing here is you've got to do the same route every day. It's a 4-day test, so you got to do, well, 3 days, maybe 4 days, but you got to do the exact same route every day. You got to have a little block of time to do this. It doesn't take much, but at the same time, you want to make these things as identical as possible as you can. So you're going to ride out there. You're going to warm up for 20 minutes towards an area that you're going to do the testing. If you have to ride a little longer, that's fine, but just at a nice endurance pace. When you're on your way out there or after your warm-up, I like to do these fast pedaling drills. I think they're good for you. They get the muscles moving and without taking a lot away from the actual effort itself. So don't focus, on doing high watts or anything. It's about fast pedaling, so that's what you're doing. Then you're going to do 3 times 5-minute VO2 max efforts. Okay, these are going to be full-on, hard as you can go, 5-minute VO2 max efforts. So definitely push yourself. You are going to be pushing in these efforts. The first time that you do this, you're going to do standing. Okay, so the entire 5 minutes you're going to stand. Okay, so we want to see a little bit of what's happening when you stand, a little bit of fatigue that occurs while you're standing, and then get enough data so that we can make a little bit of a just interpretation of what that might mean. The second one is all seated, and then the third one is you're going to do what you want to do. You're going to stand when you want to stand. You're going to sit down when you want to sit down. Okay, so that's all you're doing there. Do that one. All right, now the next one there, next slide, please. We're going to do this in these 4 days, okay? And here's how you do this. The first day, you just go out and you do it, okay? You don't have any emphasis on either leg. You just climb naturally. You do the standing one naturally. You just go for it. You don't worry about so much what's happening. I want that to be the self-selected test. Now, when you come back, you're going to look at that data. You're going to download that information from day 1, and then you're going to see which leg released less power, okay? And then you're going to emphasize that leg in day 2. Okay, so let's say, for example, the left leg released less power on the day 1, and so on day 2, you're going to emphasize that left leg. You're going to try and overcome that. You're going to try and push that one. Okay, so you'll see here in a second. It'll make a little more sense too. Then day 3, we're going to pick just the left leg to emphasize for standing and seated. All right, so you're really going to push hard with that left leg. Standing and seated, that's going to be what you do. Day 4 is going to be the right leg only. Okay, so only do that one. All right, so here we go. So let's look at some data. Next slide, please. All right, so what we're looking at here, this is day 1, okay, and you can see the 3 intervals there. I've highlighted that first one there. That's the standing interval. And this is, at the bottom, we have the mean max gross power curve, okay? So this is the mean maximal gross power curve. And in blue, we have what's gross power released on the left leg. In red, we have gross power released on the right leg, okay? And then at the bottom, you see the 2 lines there. In the pink line, that's gross power absorbed, GPA, on the left. And then the green line is GPA, or gross power absorbed, on the right. Okay, so gross power released is all of that positive power going down to pedal and move the bicycle forward. Gross power absorbed is the stuff that's not really moving the bicycle forward, okay? So there's some negative forces that occur. So in this first standing interval here, you can see that the blue line is clearly above the red line. this athlete releases more power on the left leg when they're standing. Okay, so they're absorbing about the same amount. You know, the absorption rate here, I mean, these things are almost identical on top of it, so I'm not going to worry about too much there. But again, this is day one. We're just doing it. Okay, next slide. Day one again. Now let's look at the seated portion of this interval. Okay, so this is now looking at the athlete and seeing that what has happened when they are rotting seated, it completely is the opposite of what they're doing when they're standing. Now the red line, or the right leg, is above the blue line. All right, so the right leg is releasing more power while seated than the left leg is in seated. Now, if you look down at the gross power absorbed, all right, the left leg, which is that pinkish line there, that now becomes a little higher than the gross power absorbed right. So you see that even although that the right leg is releasing more power, the left leg is absorbing more power. So think about that, right? Because what opposes the right leg from going down? The left leg coming up. Okay, so this is an interesting thing to start to work through and think about as well. All right, so that's something that we would look at down the road, and we'll talk about that in another webinar. Okay, so next slide. Now day two comes. Okay, so day two, and what we're doing in day two is, remember, we're emphasizing the leg that released less power. Okay, so in day one, our left leg was releasing the most power while standing. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're pushing very hard and trying to overemphasize the right leg while standing. Okay, so you can see for this athlete, then they almost evened up the gross power released left and the gross power released right. They're almost even. Okay, so with a tremendous effort, you know, with a lot of focus on that right leg, it gave it almost evening when you release it. Now the absorption rate didn't really change much. They're pretty much identical within a watt or so of each other, so really didn't change much on that side of it. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the next slide, please. So now we have day two seated. Okay, so this is, remember, day one seated. Okay, day one seated, the right leg released more power, the left leg released less power. So now we're going to push hard on the left leg. Okay, overemphasize that left leg, see if we can balance it out. And so that's what happens here. You see that left leg, the blue line, the gross power release for the left leg, comes up at just right there, just matches it really nicely all the way across. So this athlete was able to balance these two things out in day two by working that opposing leg, okay, pushing harder on the downstroke. However, if you look at this one again, notice right there where I have the cursor, and that was pretty representative of that, or the little vertical line there, the absorption rate is 7 watts higher than the left leg than the right leg. Okay, so while seated with this athlete pushing their left leg as hard as they can, okay, they got the balance right of the releasing power, but maybe it's at a cost. Okay, so that's something that we always are thinking about. Okay, next slide. Now comes day three. Day three, okay, so we picked the left leg just to do on day three. Okay, so we've seen a little bit. Day one, again, self-selected. Day two, using that opposing leg. Day three, let's just do the left leg. Let's just go all out, do the left leg. Because we want to see kind of what happens here. So standing, very obvious, right? The left leg is clearly releasing more power, even higher than it was when it was a self-selected one. Okay, so even higher. The absorption rate is almost identical here. It was literally within a watt, a half a watt, almost the entire time. Okay, so that's a really close one. All right, so next slide. So now in this one, we're seated, okay, and this is the left leg pushing hard again. Okay, so now there's some training that kind of happened, maybe, right? Or maybe an adaptation, or maybe there's a little bit of, you know, hey, I figured out how to do this a little bit. And that left leg is identical as of the right leg when that left leg is seated and the rodder is climbing up the hill. Again, we're still seeing that right leg absorb more power, or sorry, the left leg absorb more power, 6 watts in this case where that vertical line is, than the right leg. So that's, again, you know, you even out the release power, but what's happened here is now the result is actually a lower number overall, right? Next slide, please. Day 4 comes, and now we're going to do the right leg. Okay, so now the right leg is really going to be the thing that is emphasized, both standing and seated. In this case now, you're going to push as hard as you can with the right leg. We see that the left still dominates. The left leg, the blue line, the gross power released, is still above that right leg. So even though you're pushing as hard as you possibly can on that you know, that one leg that's releasing less power, it still is not able to match it. Now, in this athlete's case, this was where their epiphany occurred, okay? So they realized that when they came back, looked at this data, and started understanding it, and I was, you know, going over it and analyzing it, it was saying, oh, you know, what was happening here was that this athlete, when they climb standing, they actually climb off to the left of their bike, and they wobble the bike over to the right, so kind of pushing the bike to the right with their hands, and then when they bring it back, they bring the bike back up to vertical to 90 degrees, but when their right leg goes down, they never actually push the bike over to the left. So they climb with their weight over to the left side, pushing the bike to the right, but never have their weight over to the right side. So that's what that was a great insight because that is something that could be immediately fixed by this athlete by just making a change in how they pedal and when they're climbing. Okay, well, gosh, now all you have to do is you need to wobble the bike back and forth, left and right side, shifting the weight over to each side so that way you get more force on either of those things. So it took some time, right? I mean, okay, hey, you know, we could have put a video camera on this person and filmed them from behind, and we would have seen this, right? But we didn't have that opportunity here. And however, we were able to figure this out from looking at some of this data and the testing and how that may work. All right, next slide. So here, that is now standing, okay, and so now they're pushing as hard as you can with the right leg and the left leg. They're all working together, okay, so now they're almost perfectly balanced here, okay, so that's something that, again, after 3 or 4 days of this, again, there's a little bit of a learning effect that might be going on in this case, and we see what happens there, all right, so that is next slide. Oh, there it is. That's day 4. There's maybe there's double slides in there. Go back one more slide forward. Is it forward there? Was it forward or backwards? Day 4.
That was backwards.
Forward one more time. There you go. Forward one more time. There we go. That's the one I want. There we go. There we go. That's the last day. There we go. Now we're looking at the right slide. So that's the last day, the seated one. The right leg is way above that left leg. Okay, that's the one I was looking for. And you can see that, hey, that right leg is really emphasizing it. You're pushing it hard. You're really doing it. Now, in this case, from the seated perspective, there wasn't anything that was obvious in the way they were pedaling the bicycle. They were seated on the bicycle. They fit the bicycle. Any of that matter. So it has been presumed that in this case, while seated, most likely this athlete's hamstring of the left leg and gluteal of the left leg just isn't as strong as that right leg. So they could do some exercises to strengthen that left leg to see if maybe that would balance out their seated efforts there. Okay, so that would be something that you could mess with there. Alrighty, I think that is it. Tim, is there one more slide? Yeah, I think that's it. The take home here before we start our question and answers with this pedaling information is that through some basic, one little testing protocol, looking into this data, looking at some of the pedaling charts, and we have a specific pedaling chart for your workouts that has all of these, has a nice pack with mean maximal power and some scatter plots and a bunch of other things. There's the Andy Zorro chart that really allows you to dig into this information and start to pull away some things that make a difference, right? I mean, this is something that this athlete, by changing the way that just they were standing while climbing, they were able to add 10 watts more, maybe even 15 watts more to their overall power without really any additional effort by themselves. So that's a real significant change. And that's what we're trying to do here is we're looking at this, we're trying to figure out how can we make changes, what are those changes, are they going to be something that could really impact positively the way that you move forward on the bicycle, and what we're doing with that. So if you have any questions on that, ask away now, or we're available for, I'm available as well anytime.
Okay, excellent. Now I know it's kind of funny when you do a webinar with 3 different people, you're getting 3 different views, and that is a lot of stuff coming at you pretty quick. It did take us an hour to do, and we haven't gotten really many questions. I think most of them were sort of answered as we went, so I just kind of let it roll. Are there questions now while you have the 3 of us? It's an excellent opportunity to ask. I will say while you're typing questions or potentially asking questions that if you want these charts that you've seen today, just email info@wko.com. The recorded version of this will be live and up on Training Peaks probably in the next 48 hours. If you email us directly at info@WKO4.com, we will send you the chart packs to run these. Most of these are on the Chart Exchange, so you can go get them yourself if you're interested in taking a look. Okay, I think we pretty much have gotten through everything, so just thank you everybody for being on tonight and being a part of the presentation. We did end up sort of wrapping it in an hour, which is great. Uh-oh, wait, here's a question. 2 questions. One is pedaling, so I think this is for you, Hunter. Was the power balance a model or from power measured at each pedal crank?
Yes, okay, so that was measured from each pedal crank. So that was measured on a info crank, actually. The info crank was what was used in that test. So it was measured left leg and right leg. So both those cranks together and measuring independently.
Excellent. Next question is for me. And Andy, you get a gold star for asking the same question just before we started. So Dean asks, can we make a mean max chart with elevation above and or below a certain number? Yeah, you absolutely can, Dean. It will work in a mean max chart. It'll take a little bit to calculate because you're crunching a lot of numbers. But the one dilemma it brings up of, let's say you pick a number like my example of 4,000 is what works because I was in Pennsylvania at sea level or in Boulder, pretty much guaranteed to be 5,000 feet and above, so it was clean. If you have somebody who's transitioning, you're kind of taking an average of an average. So it's averaging the ride and then would average it and use that in the mean max power, because the reality is it's an if statement. So if elevation over 4,000 feet or greater than 4,000 feet is what I use to create it. I'll send you the chart and just you'll be able to pick up exactly what's in there. Just change PD curve to mean maximal power and it will calculate. Just know that if somebody started at 2,000 feet and then crossed over 4,000 and then had a really good effort at 5,000, if the average was of that file was under 4,000 feet, it would calculate into the mean maximal power of the under 4,000 feet data set. So you got to be a little careful of doing it that way just to make sure that you have a clear break. Cool. I think we got all the questions. Thanks everybody for being on tonight. Let us know if you want the charts. Just go ahead and email us. Watch our Facebook site, like us on Facebook, and watch for continued feature updates. We're targeting to get Stamina out next week with a couple of other new cool charts. So thanks for the support, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Good night now.